Welcome, everybody, to today's Hard Talk panel. I'm so grateful for those of you who are joining us live today, Wednesday, March 8th. It is International Women's Day 2023, and Women in 3D Printing is, of course, thrilled, as always, to honor this vital day. We look to an incredible chat today, time with all of you, and the wherewithal and drive to help create a stronger, more united 3D printing industry. The official International Women's Day website says, "Imagine a gender equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination, a world that's diverse, equitable, and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated. Together we can forge women's equality. Collectively we can all #embrace equity. Celebrate women's achievement, raise awareness about discrimination, take action to drive gender parity. IWD belongs to everyone, everywhere. Inclusion means all IWD Day action is valid." And in the spirit of this year's IW Day theme of #embrace equity, Women in 3D Printing is asking everyone to listen to men. Today, we're kind of flipping the script a little bit from most Women in 3D Printing panels you might be used to. You might be used to joining these talks and seeing 4 women on these stages, whether they're in person or virtual like we are today. The 3D printing industry is estimated to be 87% male and 13% female when we talk on the gender binary. And that's not quite the way the world is made. And this is only talking about gender parity. Women in 3D Printing has been expanding our mission so that it's much broader. We're really intending to create, support, and promote a 3D printing industry that is more reflective of the world in which it operates. And today, March 8th, we're very aware that the world is more than 13% female. And one of the things that we can truly do to help raise each other up, to create this more diverse industry, to create something that's more like our world, is to rely on those who are in that majority. And that's what we want to do today. So today, I don't want you to hear from me. I don't want you to hear from the other women from Women in 3D Printing. I want to talk about everyone else in the industry and how you can do more to help us create and grow this industry. It's the people who create the technology, the people who build the industry. And yes, today, most of those people are men. So let's bring 4 of our treasured, valued, leading allies in this industry to the stage to discuss allyship in additive manufacturing. I'm sure these names are familiar to you, and I'm thrilled for you to meet them. I welcome you to participate in the chat and in the Q&A. Let's keep this a conversation, keep it active. Terry, welcome to the stage. And as well, I would like to bring up, first of all, our esteemed moderator for today, Michael Molichow, who you might be familiar with, hopefully you are, as the current editor-in-chief at 3dprint.com. Michael is a brilliant ally, incredibly brilliant individual, and he's also on the board of advisors for Women in 3D Printing. Michael was a natural choice for the moderator of this panel, and I'd really like to turn it into your hands, Mike. So please bring all of our other panelists to the stage. It's yours. The conversation is here for you. And this Women's Day, I'd like to hear from our men. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much for having us. And, I feel super honored to be selected as a moderator for this. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Michael Molichow. I'm the editor-in-chief of 3dprint.com. But I guess I I feel comfortable in this situation because back, over a decade ago or so, I was trained to do intergroup dialogue to discuss, complex, sensitive issues about race and ethnicity and gender, and all the various forms of oppression and discrimination that are rampant throughout our society, sort of built into the social fabric there. So I feel kind of comfortable doing this and kind of missed doing this. So super excited to, be the moderator today. And so first I'm going to introduce everybody, and then we'll start getting the conversation going. So first I'm going to pull up Terry Wohler. So Terry, if you wouldn't mind muting your camera or whatever, and mic. Terry is, everybody knows him. He's a rock star consultant in 3D printing. He's the founder of and a principal author of the Wohler's Report. In 2021, the Wohler's was acquired by ASTM, independent operations. Terry.
Thank you, Michael.
Dr. David. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I should wait for you to say. I don't know. Anyway, so up next is David, Dr. Executive Chairperson of the Photopolymer Additive Manufacturing Alliance, PAMA, along with being the former president and CTO and the technical 3D. Hi, David. I'm going to wait for him to say hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And then we also, he is a conference producer, video podcast producer, writer, professor, and 3D printing community evangelist. He co-founded Constructed Conference LLC, which has a 2023 event taking place at NYU Tandon from August 1st to August 3rd in New York City. And he's also in the process of starting a new role this month to develop a brand new conference to launch in 2024. So you can stay tuned for that. And before that, he was the community team manager at MakerBot, the director of community and support at Adafruit, and director of community development at Ultimaker, and was the host producer of the podcast Talking Additive. Hi, Matt.
Thanks for having me on here.
Thanks everybody for coming and participating. As Sarah said, it's sort of important to hear from allies as well. And today we're going to hopefully sort of, have our own little dialogue about our role in the industry, advanced equity in the industry. But before I sort of wanted to preface that, everyone on this panel really does have the right spirit when it comes to sexism, discrimination, and oppression. We might not always communicate our thoughts and opinions in the most eloquent way. And so, in the days of cancel culture, people can sometimes be a little bit afraid to speak their minds because they're afraid of repercussions in their professional and personal lives. But everyone here in this panel is, we're doing this practice with the best of intentions. Because we're all learning here today, we're going to try our best not to judge each other on the panel or, for their position on the learning curve. So some people here have been thinking about this longer. Some people are a little newer to this conversation, but we all are here with, best intentions. So with that preface out of the way, I thought maybe the first thing we could start talking about is women in 3D printing's mission and sort of, dispel some of the myths around it. How, at every event, basically, a guy will come up to a woman in 3D printing person and say, can I go to this event? Can I go? This group is for men. Speak to that a little. Men doing here representing women in 3D printing today, and why are we including men in this conversation?
Michael, you broke up a little bit.
David had.
Michael, Terry, you broke up, but your audio broke up, so we didn't hear all of your comment or question. But maybe Sarah, you can fill in the gap.
Yes, Michael, you did break up for just a second. Maybe you want to restart your technical aspect and rejoin. But the question that we do get a lot at Women in 3D Printing is, are men welcome at Women in 3D Printing events? When we host happy hours like at Rapid, and we do hope you'll join us again in May, for these large event happy hours at Formnext, at Rapid, think any industry event, or the local chapter meetups, are men welcome? The answer is always yes. Not just welcome, but, encouraged. So I want to hear from each of you how and why you have come to feel welcome and to participate in this community. So I think that's where Michael was going with that. I'll jump back out, and hopefully we are keen on technical side now.
So I'll kick that off because I think that's what I heard where it was going. So, you know, many of the members here are advisory board members for Women in 3D Printing. I'm a little bit further apart from the organization, but what I would say is there are different types of women and gender focused organizations out there, right? Some organizations are focused on women supporting women and having an internalized safe space, which I think is really critical, right? But Women in 3D Printing, from everything I've learned and interacting with the board and several board members, is very much focused on a community supporting women. And, you know, as Sarah started this conversation off with explaining, the current community is roughly split on, you know, an 87 to 13% gender bias towards men. So as we talk about how do we make institutional changes in this community that make it more accessible to women and make it a more welcoming environment so that we get closer to gender parity, I think having an organization that welcomes men into the conversation as active listeners and creating safe spaces where men can come and ask sometimes hard and challenging questions, right? And feel safe that they're going to be supported in their learning process, and to have a path where they can, you know, express a question, maybe in not always the most articulate way, and learn in that process. Because I feel 20 years ago, I helped a number of friends start up an alumni collegiate chapter of Society of Women in Engineering. And one of the most transformational changes we had was panels of women talking about what it was like to come to work in, you know, steel-toed boots from a chemical plant, right, to men, and some of the sexism that they face from both men and women, right, and giving a forum for men to also listen and hear experiences that otherwise, without that kind of a forum in a workplace, you never would have known about. And it enabled a huge amount of learning in the chemical engineering field over the last 50 years, right? To the point where actually it's one of the few fields of engineering that is roughly 50-50 if you look at the gender bias and gender parity. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to some of the other speakers.
Well, I wanted to jump in. So I'm in New York City, and I feel like the New York City Women in 3D Printing chapter is sort of a special case in the sense that from my experience, you know, men have often come, and there's been less hesitancy, and I think it might be a little bit of the New York City factor there, where there's so many amazing women entrepreneurs in film, TV, entertainment, fashion, architecture, design. So it feels like we're kind of more expecting here that, of course, a lot of the badass contributors will be women, which is a really nice scenario. And in fact, I think that in part as a result, the discussion has really leapt forward to some of the questions of intersectionality and other DEI concerns have like raised to the forefront maybe a while back. But there's something that's happened here that I think is really important, that essentially, you know, these activities have become the primary activity for community in 3D printing in this region, and for good reason. Not only are those who are organizing it really doing an amazing job of drawing people together by shifting things to look towards a future mix that is much more inclusive. It is you're expecting to see where things are going and where the exciting you know, new tech and evolving tech will be in this space. So that's just, you know, it's a plug for hoping, you know, other chapters can have this experience where, you know, these events are now really, you know, feeding the whole thing, and of course are great opportunities to focus on celebrating and addressing concerns that would block and be obstacles for bringing these amazing women into these fields.
Yeah, David and Matt, you created a nice foundation for what I was wanting to say here. You know, I grew up with women. My mother, my sister, we have a daughter, we have granddaughters. And when I first attended engineering related events back in the 1980s, I would look around and it's like, it was out of balance, and it is today. And it's like, it just didn't feel right. It's like, where are the women? They have as much, or in many cases more, to contribute than men. And so I'm hopeful that we can see more balance in the future. And I was first introduced to women in 3D printing in South Africa. I'd heard about it, but the first event a few years ago I attended, it was a panel session, which was brilliantly done. And I've since attended many, I don't know, probably a dozen or more events, either in person or live. And it really has brought, I think, that missing piece. Now, we still don't have that 50-50 balance that we're seeking, but it is bringing vibrance and talent and a lot of fun. A lot of the events have been social. And I like women. I like all people. But, it's and so I think it's great. And I applaud the success of the organization. The fact that it has grown so quickly in such a relatively short period of time is just, my jaw hits the ground, because I can't really name another organization in additive manufacturing or even the broader manufacturing community that has grown like women in 3D printing. So I'm just very, very happy and privileged to be a part of it.
I hope you guys can hear me now. I think that was all very well put by everyone, and yeah, the growth has been sort of amazing, which is sort of demonstrates the need for such an organization in this space. It wouldn't be growing if it wasn't something essential and critical to the growth of this industry. And I guess that sort of all of that sort of lays next. David, that it's not necessarily like a support group for people within, a target identity to help one another. It's about pushing outside of that group to, improve equity throughout. And that wouldn't be possible without the gatekeepers, which would be the, male members of the community. So I guess with this next question, I'm wondering, how we know these men here like women in 3D printing and what's going on, but what can we do? What can men in the industry do to help push this goal forward of equity across gender, race, ability, all the different targeted groups and oppression there? In other words, what makes a good ally?
Okay, got it. So I'll kick us off again. So when I look at DEI in general, and I try to look at the field, right, I think a lot of the conversation is having a forum in which men can come and listen and learn, right? I think there's a lot of corporate marketing that has become adopted, and almost, we hear the term greenwashing for, we're going to put a bio label on something and make it look good and sell it as a product. I see a lot of commercialization around gender parity that goes on, right? Almost every corporation has some public facing statement about it now. You can't go on without that, right? But no one's really talking about, these are the changes that we made at our organization this last year to help push gender parity, or to help make our interview process more welcoming to the handful of women that are graduating in some of these engineering disciplines, right? So one of the things that I really think we can all do, part of the challenge of allyship and supporting women into 3D printing is the feed chain. And I think the only way you do that is through STEM outreach and supporting women at younger stages as they go into STEM, so that as people graduate with appropriate degrees and expertise in 3D printing, it naturally builds into our entire, ecosystem as an established industry, right? That is one of the most effectual things we can do. And I think another thing is allyship needs to go beyond the corporate marketing, and we need to talk about standing up for discriminatory practices that go on in the workplace, coming up with policies that make it no tolerance, right? Or at least help to facilitate the hard conversations, right? What I've seen a lot of is when you don't have these hard conversations in a more formal environment like what we're having now, they typically happen at a bar with alcohol involved where there are lower inhibitions and people are a little bit braver. And those are actually the wrong location to have those sometimes, because then you're being even less articulate and you're more likely to offend, and unfortunately. So if you create these situations and you create spaces where people can have the hard conversations, it helps to move this all forward, I think, as an ally.
I mean, I was sort of chuckling to myself when we all kind of froze for a second there, like how to dive into this, because we have so much to say about this. We're all four of us, people who really care about this topic, and and see a really positive and constructive role that allyship can have in bringing about these kind of outcomes that we would like to see with not only just equity, but like really changing the power dynamic so that there really is inclusion all the way up and down the leadership chain, because the field really needs this. I mean, it's not just sort of a nice to have to say, this would be like a nice thing. Let's see what we can do to introduce it. It's the field has opportunities to grow and to address more of the concerns of humans and mankind by drawing more widely from those who can understand the problems, recognize the opportunities, and find business strategies, et cetera. And so when it comes to allyship, we have this should be like seeing this panel of four men talking about this topic. It should feel weird. Like this is not how you design necessarily a panel for a conference. You need other voices. There are missing voices here. So it's kind of a strange kind of ethnographic study here of us, sort of approaching it from this way. But it's interesting from the perspective of, we're each ones who, care about allyship and want to necessarily, take steps, take action to make sure to kind of help foster and help, allow for situations in which those with marginalized voices can be heard and their experiences known. Like that's definitely something that we all share, but different strategies exist for how to do that. And I think in general, my position on this is that allyship is not a status to claim, but it's a practice. It's something that all of us should be mindful that the goals that we're going for, those bold goals of having a lot of people really contributing, really shaping and leading, making the decisions that right now, aren't necessarily represented in proportion at all. We can do things to stand up now to sort of guide things, but we have to also attend to the value of changing the power dynamic over time. And that's why David's starting with pointing at like STEM education. That's really it. I think I probably could have summed up everything I'm saying by saying that I think that this panel on allyship is an opportunity for all of us to think about these concerns at a career level and beyond, of how we can all collectively try to bring about a better scenario, one in which we're learning from and listening to each other and making sure that we're heard. And so look beyond just the trying to patch a situation of today, but really see where are the opportunities to make sure that those emerging into the field are going to shape it and lead it and take it somewhere amazing.
That's great. Yeah, I think to me personally, this panel feels like a good start to some allyship from us four guys. And then I think there's a lot more, obviously, that can be done. I think that for me personally, I feel like everyone should be playing to their own personal strengths and positions of power. And so for me, one of the things that I feel like I can do is I'm able to write and advocate in my writing. And I feel like doing this sort of moderation of this panel feels like, at least using some skill I may or may not have, you guys be the judge, to do my own advocacy work. I guess so. There's a there's this question that I keep wanting to get to because it's sort of one of I feel I wanted to begin with this, but we sort of agreed we should hold off a little bit. But it sort of speaks to what Benny asked in the chat, which is how do we encourage those who disagree or don't think that this is important enough topic to address? I feel like what I want to ask next sort of gets to that a little bit. And that is like, so we'll talk about Benny's questions explicitly too, but one thing I thought is interesting for people of various groups, is that issue of intersectionality. So we are white, male identifying people, but the world is much more complicated than that. So I wanted to ask these guys if there's ever been a time when they have been excluded or been a minority in a situation that helped them to understand the perspective of discriminated against or oppressed groups at society at large. So if you guys want to speak to that.
Yeah, I can start. The First Lady of Ukraine said today at the 3050 summit that this is an important day for women, but it shouldn't happen only one day per year. And I couldn't agree more. And at that same event, Billie Jean King, I caught this earlier, it's like 5:30 this morning. We do not understand, I'm paraphrasing here, we do not understand inclusion until we've been excluded. And I could not agree more with that. And so that is really, I think, a part of your question, Michael. Many years ago, I was in a country that I won't name, but it was in the Middle East. And I was at a convenience store and I was in line. There was a person or two ahead of me, and I was watching the behavior of them as they are going through the checkout line, and the person that was ringing up their order and the person the employee there was smiling and interactive with these people and putting the things in the bag and the receipt and all of that, and came to me. And wow, I mean, this was the first time I've felt this way. She hardly looked at me. She didn't put it, she just threw things on the counter, no bag. I don't think I got a receipt. It was just so cold and so different than how she treated the others. And that was, I think, my first and maybe one of my only times where I felt discrimination. I was excluded, and it hurt. It really did. And I'd never forgotten about that. And I think you really, like Billie Jean King says, you really can't understand until you've experienced it. And I'd love to hear other stories. And I think I think for people who haven't experienced it, it's hard to really know, to really appreciate and understand the millions of people that probably daily experience these kinds of have these kinds of experiences. And it was just it was an eye opener. I've never forgotten it.
Well, I wanted to say that first of all, thanks for sharing that story, Terry. I definitely have experienced analogous things that help me to empathize with this scenario that we're talking about. But I think it may be worth mentioning, as part of acknowledging privilege, that I don't think I have faced the level of difficulty that some of my past, coworkers, colleagues, friends in this field have shaped, that have either shaped or even yeah, at least strongly impacted their lives. So I try to be mindful of ways that help me enter into understanding, and also that there is a little difference. Um, so that is a way of answering this by saying that I definitely have been a human being that has faced experiences that are challenging, um, but am constantly amazed by stories I learned from spending time talking to friends who are facing obstacles that are more strict than I've experienced.
So there are a couple of questions that got brought up, right? So at a high level, everyone on this panel is aware, and many of the members of Women in 3D Printing are aware, but I'm an openly gay man, right, operating in the 3D printing world. And I've had a number of different experiences through my career and being open at different degrees with my sexuality over time. And it's probably not a surprising or controversial statement to say that while misogynistic behavior is obviously very different than homophobic behavior, the Venn diagram of overlap of those two circles is a pretty big circle, right? Generally speaking, those two things go hand in hand. And I think, talk about, and I try to think through that process, right, of coming out as a scientist and engineer in my professional life outside of my private life. That's not something that's always keen at mind, right? It's about how excellent are you at your topic is usually more important in some of these things to some of us, right? And I have an optionality, right? That's something that women don't come out as women. They face it every day, right? And that discriminating action every day. I remember being in academia, and academia is a very diverse place. You have people from a lot of different cultures and backgrounds. And that's great diversity of thought, but it also means you're meeting different people at different points on that evolutionary scale. Just like when you go overseas and you're going to have a culture that doesn't have the same values that we might have in the US. And so you're on one hand, being in a minority situation, trying to deal with that and, walk through in a polite way and an understanding way some of these conversations. But it's also very different when one goes from, and having experienced, there's a slight comment or slice or a slight made against you, which is not inherently meant or intended to harm. But then when you face the action that is inherently intended to, well, I'm going to out you to try to leverage you in a certain situation. I absolutely had that during my PhD, where people try to leverage something or knowledge against me, right? It was an awkward moment with my PhD advisor where I had to have a coming out discussion with my very homophobic PhD advisor, right? Because I was not going to let that be used to leverage against me, right? By parties that were open to doing that. And that was just in academia. Right. As I got into 3D printing, I mean, as an industry goes, and then when you look across some of the more broad experience that I've absolutely seen toxic and very direct misogyny. Absolutely. Because I will be the guy at the bar and people don't necessarily know what team I'm on. And I can see it, and it's absolutely there. That being said, I think there are many people in this field that have very open minds and are actively working through it. And those are just two different breeds of people. When we're talking about how one deals with, people that refuse to change their mind or how to confront them, right? I've seen a couple of great examples of it. If we were at AMUG last year, some of the leadership and at some points on stage, there was kind of sexist language being used and tropes being used that made people, I certainly cringed in the audience. And I'm not maybe as sensitive as some of the rest of the audience there that were women in a very, very slim minority, in a very tiny minority. And I really admired, Kristen going up and having a conversation and kind of watched it from the sidelines behind a booth and kind of watch some of the conversations that Kristen had and trying to say, hey, do you understand why this might have been offensive? And I think a lot of people responded positively to that engagement. That being said, I think it's always a delicate balance of how you approach things, right? Humans in general don't want to be approached with very harsh stances, right? If you go to Thanksgiving with your family and you start citing facts or figures about politics, it generally doesn't go well for the conversation and moving someone forward, right? And that's just humans. I got an email the other day of, oh, I don't think you should have said that and you shouldn't be saying these things publicly. And my innate response, whether it was right or wrong, my innate response as a human was, screw you, I'm allowed to say what I want to say, right? I'm allowed to have an opinion whether you agree with it or disagree, right? That type of attack actually shuts down the conversation. Where if someone goes, oh, you know, you might have been more articulate and you might have represented yourself better if you would have thought about saying it this way. That actually causes a lot more self-reflection, and you will sit there in the back of your mind and you will go through that comment infinitely more by approaching it in that different way, right? So I think sometimes a more delicate indication from someone that is coming from a sincere place of caring and shows that they care about you and they're concerned actually can have infinitely more input than more of a scolding type activist. And that has nothing to do with men versus women. It has to do with us as human beings and how we respond to conflict in situations like that, I think.
Yeah, I think all of those instances are great, and why I thought that sort of answered Benny's question to an extent is I feel like, and it is sort of related to the follow-up question. It doesn't answer it, but it's related. I think basically by trying to get people to empathize, you can get them to sort of begin to understand the other side of the fence, I guess. So, what Terry might have experienced in that country, it could add to do with him being an American and Americans, being associated with some bad foreign stuff, but it could also be, just a feeling of otherness and feeling like a situation. And so that nature of that, it's the beginning point for empathy. It was an eye opener for him. And then if you bring up intersectionality, not everybody is one single identity. So like David was describing, just because he's a white man doesn't mean he hasn't experienced oppression in other ways. And sort of, I feel like that is a gateway for people who don't necessarily agree with these conversations. And then, like David said, it's like discussing things in terms of empathy, from a judgment-free perspective. We're all humans. We were all raised in this society that is sexist and racist and everything. So at least from our perspectives, because we, so just to rephrase, Benny's question is, how do we encourage those who disagree or don't think that this is important? How do we get them to engage with this topic? And so, yeah, I guess it's, to me, a point of empathy and understanding, and try to get them to understand through empathy. But I guess a follow-up question that I think is related, someone asked, why do men always seem to only relate to these issues in terms of the women they know? Does it not hit home until they have a wife, daughter, or sister that's related? And I think that plays to the empathy part. But if anyone wants to address that and talk about it, that'd be great.
So maybe I'll kick that off. I think inherently all humans have a selfish tendency to them, and it's really easy to not have empathy for the abstract persona compared to those around you that you are seeing on a normal day, right? And you kind of live life and you look at different degrees of suffering in the immediate vicinity around you, and it is very hard to have abstract, and this is across the board, right? Not on just this issue, but okay, when you think about what goes into the lithium ions in that battery and you look into it, it doesn't look all that great when you start to see the lithium mines in Africa, right? So it's really easy to say, but I really love my cell phone and I'm not going to give it up at the same time. So it's very easy to have empathy for things very close to you, generically across the board, right? And I mean, for me, it started off, like I said, with Society of Women Engineers in college, and having friends and colleagues that are friends and colleagues first, right? Saying, oh, I just had to deal with this today. And that really opened my eyes and said, well, that's absurd, right? And we need to have a bigger, broader conversation around it. So, and then at the same time, I mean, from my perspective as a gay man, and talking about that Venn diagram of overlap, there's also a selfish side to it. I'll be very direct and honest. I grew up in an era of Matthew Shepard, right? That was happened while I was in high school. So that painted a very clear and very disparate picture of what my life was going to be like if I did to have women that understood what some of those tropes were like and what it was to experience some of that. And having empathy from another party to support me, right? So I think when something happens to you, you understand it immediately. When something happens to someone that is close to you, it is much easier to empathize. But the further you get away, the harder it is in that abstract analysis. And lastly, I guess the one thing I would share is, it's semi-public now that, I had a less than ideal departure with my last employer in a discriminatory fashion. I will tell you, the first people that I called up and talked about it and talked through what was going on in my life were half the board of women in 3D printing. And what was resoundingly supportive to me was when I would describe a trope, I didn't have to get into details because they had already experienced that same exact trope of misogyny or sexist language or slanted language. And they understand the dog whistle exactly. And it was also many, of the men I talked to, very few people ever followed up. But it was actually board members of Women in 3D Printing that would call me up and text me 3 days later and say, hey, I want to make sure you're mentally in a good place and you're still doing okay, right? After being kicked out of a company that I spent 7 years of my life building from the ground up. So even the way that women responded, I think that to me showed me how it hit very close to women. My experience as a gay man, they immediately empathetically understood it and had a more strong response to that than they might other acts of racism if you were a white woman, not fully understanding maybe the complexities there. So I think it goes both ways, and it's a proximity basis and part of human nature, sadly.
Yeah, I just want to add that, it's not like flipping a switch for people, they're thinking. I think it really is a journey. It's, I had to look up allyship to really understand what, the sort of the general meaning of it is. And, it's a lifelong process of building and nurturing supportive relationships, with the underrepresented and marginalized, discriminated people and groups. And for me, I think it comes partly with maturity. I think, being younger, maybe growing up in certain parts of the world or country. I grew up in a rural area in central Nebraska, town of 2,000 people, and a very homogeneous population. And, we didn't talk about certain things. We didn't, it was very, and as you get out and travel and learn, and this event itself is a step in the right direction. It's getting people to begin to think about it. And I think that's so important. So I encourage us to look at ways we can integrate these kinds of discussions in our technical programs at whether it's Women in 3D Printing or at AMUG or Rapid or FormNext or whatever event you choose to attend. I think it's healthy. It's really healthy because it does get you, I think it plants seeds and it forces people to think about it when they may not otherwise, they may not really occur to them. So I think, I like what we're doing today.
It's sort of like Jungian therapy, like you have to confront, these darker parts of yourself. And even if it is sort of scary to confront reality, it makes you a more whole person at the end of the day. And I think a healthier, happier person at the end of the day as you understand these things. Going back to Benny's question about, how can you get people who don't agree with this to see, to talk about it. It actually makes you feel like a happier, better person when you understand the suffering of other people. So it's about time to start wrapping up, I guess. We do have another question from the chat, but if anybody else wants to say anything before we address that question, go for it now.
Well, I wanted to dive into something that I think is kind of an interesting thing to consider in terms of allyship, which was, I'll put this, I'll describe this scenario as an amalgam of several scenarios to not single out somebody. But I had an experience in the past where, I had a really good relationship with a boss who was really, forthcoming and dynamic in conversations I was having, with this person. And but then I started noticing that this person was not having these conversations with women, and because I was sort of in kind of a tight circle with this boss. uh he would share thoughts about the women on my team, women that I thought and still think are absolutely amazing and dynamic, that they're not well, they're great, but they're not strategic, they're not leaders. And and I recognize something interesting there. First, well, first it was not true, because these were the women that actually were the backbone of all the success that we were having in the projects that we were doing, and they actually were tremendously strategic. And part of their strategy was needing to work around a capriciousness of saying no that could happen from this boss who wasn't necessarily receptive to be able to listen. And I tried to, well, and I spoke up and I said, no, I don't think this is true. I think these women are great. Let's do more with them. Let's give them leadership roles. And I experienced something sort of odd, which was that this boss started to not trust my advice, and started sort of pushing me to the side and thinking and calling to question my leadership ability because I wasn't agreeing with him. Here's one of the things that I realized after this is that I thought that, I was having this great experience and that I had this, unique opportunity. I didn't realize I actually wasn't in a position of power in that situation at all. From the standpoint of this boss who was really seeing himself reflected in me, what wasn't actually listening to or interested in what I had to say. And so anything that I did sort of defined me as different than uh, his perspective. It sort of shut things down there. But I realized that my attempt to sort of push back in that way, to just like in the same context of kind of an old boys club kind of scenario, let's have a different label. You've said this thing. I'm going to say no. It's this other thing. I'm going to push back. Um, it didn't change the dynamic. It didn't lead to a situation where these coworkers who I really wanted to elevate could have a shot at getting, uh, you know, overcoming this position this kind of rigid position that they couldn't do the things that they really wanted to do, and were proving they could do. And so I started thinking that one of the roles of allyship, and if you are in a position of privilege that gets you in these positions, is needing to sort of think a little kind of further beyond like that immediate exchange. How can you change things so that you might not have luck convincing this person who is a little bit of an obstacle for progress here, but you can help to change the scenario by not trying to just use the same tool of privilege that might have benefited you, but say, let's not have conversations about whether somebody's good or bad. Let's focus on a way to change how we measure and report on what people are contributing. Because that's the thing, is that the women that this boss couldn't see their value, couldn't see that the importance of elevating them. They actually we're already contributing more. And so that's something that's stuck with me, and I often sort of will try to sort of use my scenario to, you know, kind of help, change things, uh, so that there's a way to further the goals of elevating others in the organizations where I'm working by changing the terms in which these things go forward, and getting away from this sense of um, these kind of parental roles that actually were in play there, that we're not contributing. I just wanted to contribute that before we go on, because that has a lot to do with, for me, with strategies to really change things within teams where maybe you don't have the opportunity to address it as directly as you'd like.
I love that. Yeah, it's I wish that this panel was 8 weeks long, and each week we could talk about a different topic, because I feel like that would fall after 8 weeks of self-reflection. We start going forward with how to actually introduce these activist ideas to the world, and like that's a great one. Like sometimes you have to sort of flip things on their head, or like go outside of the paradigm that's already in place by the patriarchy and by the dominant structure, in order to do the work. Like if you play in the system, then you're just perpetuating the system. But if you can sidestep it somehow, then maybe there's a way to come up with some actual change. We have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone have anything else to say, or should we answer this question that's in the Q&A?
I'll quickly try to piggyback off of something Matt had said. Right. You talked about the quote, good old boy, which I grew up in the South. That is one of the common things. Right. And I remember one of the jokes was a parody off of Gay for Pay. Right. Which is like straight men prostituting for money. Right. It was, well, David, straight for government contract. Because when you walk into a room with the DoD and you're trying to secure that contract, how you present is very important to some of that group. And, I have the privilege of how, quote, out I am at any given point, right? And I think it's really important for everyone, as we talk about these things, to understand when it comes to race and when it comes to gender, that doesn't necessarily ever turn off. Right. And I think that's a really unique distinguisher. Right. And also, when you're in this role, sometimes you don't want to be known as on the board of women in 3D printing and you represent women. Right. Not one person ever necessarily wants to be the face of a single group. That is not always a fun role to play. I think it's a necessary role that we step up into and have a public presence. And I think, at the end of the day, I want to be known, and I think a lot of people that do know me is the guy that's going to geek out about molecules and chemistries at the bar, because that's what I do best, right? And not the token gay representative or the DEI person or whatever it might be. So I think that's always a challenge that women are constantly having and being forced into a position of place to advocate for themselves, as well as it's something that the monikers and the commentary about emotional and things like that, that is something that never turns off, and it can be very wearing and wear people down over time.
Terry, did you want to provide a final comment before? I think we might be able to talk a little bit longer, because I think most of us have a window of time after this, but maybe Terry, if you want to provide like sort of a final comment.
Okay, you didn't ask me to do this in advance, so this is off the cuff, and I don't want to take up time unnecessarily, but I'm happy to try to summarize to the extent that I can that we've come together to address an issue that I personally have never talked about publicly, and often don't do it privately, honestly. And it's just sort of gets swept under the cup, under the rug. We look the other way. But I think it's healthy. It's necessary, honestly, to get it to the forefront, and to gender equality is so incredibly important, as are the other elements of discrimination that women in 3D printing and the world faces every day. And I'm just so glad that I'm a part of this, and that our panelists were willing to be a part of this, and that I counted, I think, 18 or so people that joined us. And I'm hoping that we can continue the conversation, and we can organize, whether they're structured or more organic in nature. I think it's all healthy, and I just applaud the work of the people behind Women in 3D Printing, and I applaud also the International Women's Day. I didn't mention that the two people I quoted earlier, they're in Abu Dhabi in UAE, and they, that's you see suppression there of women in the Middle East in general, but also in the UAE, and so I applaud them for doing what they're doing, to be vocal and to bring this to the forefront. So thanks, Michael, for the opportunity.
So I know Sarah, oh, here she comes. Okay.
Me again. Because we are at the top of the hour, I want to respect everyone's time. And I know we have a few of our esteemed speakers with a hard stop. So with that, I would like to greatly thank Michael, Terry, David, Matt. You are all incredible assets to this industry. People I feel very privileged to know personally, and obviously I greatly respect the work you all do and lead in your fields, from education to media to analysis to developing so much very cool technology. And I think you're all incredible examples of allyship, consciously and unconsciously. So thank you again for your time. Everyone joining us live today, I am leaving the floor open. The great thing about the platform that we're using today, Remo, is that you're able to sit at tables and just talk like humans. So I know a few of our speakers are able to stay a little bit today, so keep picking their brains. They're not scared, they're not shy. I've also taken the liberty of adding each of their LinkedIn profiles into the chat, so look them up. They clearly want to be your friend. And by friend, I mean excellent resource in terms of professional additive manufacturing experience and expertise. So on behalf of Women in 3D Printing and our DEI work group, thank you, everyone, for this incredible Hard Talks panel this International Women's Day. I will be closing the presentation now, and again, do welcome you to stay active in the chat, on the floor, and for those of you watching the recording, we will have the links to all of these resources in the description box below. Like and subscribe, that's what people say, right? That's what happens when it goes to YouTube. So thank you all, and again, happy International Women's Day. We celebrate all of you, women, allies, non-binary, and everyone joining us today. So thank you again.